The morning dew still clung to the grass when Sarah Martinez stepped out of her small ranch house, coffee mug in hand, breathing in the crisp October air that carried the familiar scent of hay and distant wood smoke from neighboring properties. At 24, she had inherited this modest spread in rural Montana from her grandmother just 8 months ago, trading her cramped Seattle apartment for 40 acres of rolling hills, weathered fencing, and a responsibility she never thought she'd want. The transition hadn't been easy, and most days she still felt like she was playing house in someone else's life, but something about the endless sky and the way the sunrise painted the Rockies in shades of gold and pink made her believe she might actually belong here. Her nearest neighbor, Tom Fletcher, was already moving around his property 300 yards away, his silhouette visible as he tended to his small herd of cattle. Tom had been nothing but helpful since she'd arrived, teaching her about irrigation schedules, explaining which local contractors were trustworthy, and occasionally dropping off fresh eggs from his chickens with the gruff kindness of someone who understood that city folk needed extra guidance to survive out here. His wife Martha had passed away 2 years earlier, and Sarah suspected her presence provided him with someone to look after, filling a void that his grown children, scattered across different states with their own busy lives, couldn't quite fill. The old red barn that dominated her property had seen better days, its paint peeling and some of the boards warped from decades of harsh winters, but it served its purpose for storing hay, tools, and the random collection of farm equipment that came with the property. She'd been meaning to have the electrical system checked, particularly after noticing some flickering lights in the main section, but like so many maintenance tasks in her new life, it kept getting pushed to the bottom of an ever-growing list. Her budget was tight, stretched between property taxes, equipment repairs, and the reality that her freelance graphic design work didn't generate quite the same income out here where reliable internet was more hope than guarantee. This particular morning felt different somehow, charged with an energy that made her restless as she walked the perimeter of her property, checking the fence line where the wild turkeys had been testing the boundaries between her land and the national forest beyond. The weather forecast had mentioned possible thunderstorms later in the day, and she could feel that electric tension building in the air, the way the humidity seemed to press against her skin despite the cool temperature. She'd learned to trust these atmospheric moods since moving here, recognizing patterns that city life had never taught her to notice. It was while she was examining a section of fence that had been damaged by a fallen branch that she first heard the barking. Not the casual territorial announcement that dogs in rural areas exchange throughout the day, but something urgent and distressed that made her straighten up and scan the landscape. The sound seemed to be coming from the direction of her barn, but she couldn't see any dogs in the immediate area. She'd been considering getting a dog herself, partly for companionship and partly for the practical benefits of having an animal that could alert her to wildlife or intruders, but hadn't quite worked up the nerve to take on another responsibility. As she walked back toward the house, planning to investigate after finishing her morning routine, the barking intensified, accompanied by what sounded almost like whimpering. There was something deeply unsettling about the sound, a desperation that cut through her morning calm and demanded attention. She changed direction, heading directly toward the barn, her pace quickening as some primal instinct began sending warning signals through her nervous system. The smell hit her first, acrid and chemical, completely wrong for a rural morning that should have been filled with the clean scents of grass and earth. Smoke, definitely smoke, but with an electrical undertone that made her stomach clench with recognition and fear. As she rounded the corner of the barn, she saw it, thin grey wisps seeping through gaps in the wooden siding near the electrical panel, and her heart began racing as the full implications crashed over her in a wave of panic and disbelief. Fire in a rural area wasn't just a building problem. It was a catastrophe waiting to consume everything she'd inherited, everything she'd been trying to build, and potentially spread to Tom's property, or even the forest beyond. Her hands shaking, she pulled out her phone and dialed 911, knowing even as she did that the volunteer fire department was 25 minutes away on a good day, and this definitely wasn't shaping up to be a good day. The dispatcher's calm professionalism provided a small anchor of stability. As Sarah tried to describe her location using the rural addressing system she still wasn't entirely comfortable with, stumbling over section numbers and road descriptions while smoke continued to thicken visibly. But even as she focused on providing clear information to emergency services, the barking continued, now clearly coming from inside the barn, and she realized with a horror that seemed to slow time itself that there was an animal trapped in there. The ethical weight of the situation crashed down on her with physical force, her grandmother's voice echoing in her memory, with stories about barn fires and the terrible choices they sometimes forced on people, the split-second decisions between personal safety and moral obligation that defined character, in ways that comfortable urban life never demanded. The dispatcher was giving her instructions about staying away from the structure, about meeting the fire department at the road to guide them in, practical advice that made perfect sense from a safety perspective, but felt impossible to follow with those desperate sounds coming from inside the burning building. She found herself walking closer to the barn despite every logical thought telling her to retreat, drawn by an impulse she couldn't name or resist, while smoke began to billow more heavily from the gaps in the siding. The main doors were on the opposite side from where the electrical fire seemed to have started, and when she reached them, she could see that the smoke hadn't yet filled the entire structure, though it was spreading quickly along the ceiling and creating a layer of toxic air that would soon make breathing impossible. The barking was definitely coming from somewhere near the back of the barn, behind stacks of hay bales and old equipment, and as her eyes adjusted to the dim interior, she could make out movement in the shadows. What she found there would replay in her dreams for months afterward. A small golden retriever puppy, probably no more than 3 months old, tangled in a piece of old rope that had somehow gotten wrapped around its leg and tethered it to a heavy piece of machinery. The rope was just tight enough, and the machine just heavy enough that the puppy's frantic struggles had only made the situation worse, creating a knot that panic and fear had drawn impossibly tight. The animal's eyes were wide with terror, its golden fur already darkened with soot, and when it saw her approach it increased its desperate attempts to break free, making small whimpering sounds that cut through her heart like physical wounds. The smoke was getting thicker, and she could hear the crackling sound that meant the fire was spreading, probably through the old wiring that ran along the barn's main support beams. Her eyes were beginning to water, and she knew that every second spent in the structure increased the danger exponentially. But looking at this helpless creature, she also knew that leaving wasn't an option her conscience could survive. Her grandmother had always said that character was revealed in moments when no one else was watching, when the only judge was your own ability to live with your choices. Getting down on her knees beside the puppy, she tried to project calm, while her fingers worked frantically at the tangled rope, speaking in what she hoped was a soothing voice, even as her heart hammered against her ribs and smoke burned her throat. The puppy seemed to sense her intention and stopped struggling quite as violently, though it continued to pant heavily and make small distressed sounds that spoke of confusion and terror beyond anything a young animal should have to experience. The knot was impossibly complex, drawn tight by the puppy's struggles, and complicated by the type of old rope that seemed designed to resist untying under the best of circumstances, much less while smoke filled the air and time ran out with every passing second. She tried to remember if she'd seen any tools nearby, anything sharp enough to cut through the rope, but the smoke was making it harder to think clearly, and she realized that leaving to search for something would mean losing precious time while conditions deteriorated further. Her fingers were cramping from the effort, and she could taste the smoke now, thick and bitter in her mouth, making her cough in a way that seemed to panic the puppy even more. The sound of the fire was getting louder, a low roar that suggested it had found plenty of fuel in the old wooden structure, and she knew that the window for safe escape was closing rapidly. But then, with a sudden give that felt almost miraculous, one of the crucial loops in the knot loosened enough for her to work her fingers underneath it. The relief was overwhelming, but short-lived, as she realized that freeing the rope was only the first challenge. The puppy, traumatized by the experience, and now faced with a stranger in a terrifying situation, didn't understand that she was trying to help and began struggling again as soon as the rope loosened, making it harder to complete the untangling process. She had to use one arm to gently but firmly hold the small body still, while her other hand worked at the remaining tangles, all while fighting the urge to cough and trying to ignore the way the smoke was making her eyes stream. When the rope finally came free completely, the puppy immediately tried to bolt, but she managed to scoop it up against her chest, feeling the rapid flutter of its heartbeat through its small rib cage and the way its whole body trembled with fear and confusion. The animal was lighter than she'd expected, probably underfed, and she could feel how fragile and vulnerable it was as she held it close and turned toward the barn doors that now seemed impossibly far away through the thickening smoke. The journey back to the entrance felt like it took forever, though it probably lasted less than 30 seconds. Her world narrowed to the feeling of the puppy's warm weight against her chest, the burning sensation in her lungs, and the desperate need to reach clean air before the situation became truly dangerous. She could hear sirens in the distance now, the volunteer fire department finally responding, but they were still minutes away from being able to do anything helpful. When she finally burst out of the barn into the clean morning air, gasping and coughing while the puppy squirmed in her arms, she found Tom Fletcher running toward her across the field that separated their properties, his weathered face etched with concern and something that might have been admiration. Behind him, she could see his old pickup truck parked at an angle that suggested he'd abandoned it quickly when he saw the smoke, and she realized he'd probably been preparing to attempt his own rescue if she hadn't emerged when she did. The puppy seemed to calm slightly once they were away from the smoke and noise, though it continued to tremble and pant heavily, its small pink tongue hanging out as it tried to process the overwhelming experience. Tom reached them just as she was checking the animal for injuries, his hands surprisingly gentle as he helped examine the rope burns on its leg and the general condition of its golden coat, which was matted with soot but didn't seem to hide any serious wounds. The fire department arrived with the efficiency that spoke of long experience with rural emergencies, their truck navigating her rough driveway with practiced skill while she stood at a safe distance, holding the puppy and watching her barn begin to succumb to flames that had now broken through the roof in several places. The volunteers worked with methodical determination, but it was clear that saving the structure was no longer the goal. Containing the fire and preventing it from spreading to the nearby grass, and eventually the forest had become the priority. Chief Rodriguez, a man in his 50s who'd been fighting fires in this county for over 20 years, approached her while his crew worked to establish a perimeter and begin their suppression efforts. His questions were professional but kind, focused on understanding how the fire had started and ensuring that no one else might be in danger, but she could see in his expression the same mixture of concern and respect that she'd noticed in Tom's face. The puppy had calmed enough to begin showing curiosity about its surroundings, its head lifting to take in the unusual activity and the presence of strangers, though it made no attempt to leave the security of her arms. She found herself wondering where it had come from, how it had ended up tangled in her barn, and what would happen to it now that its accidental shelter was being destroyed by flames that sent thick black smoke billowing into the clear Montana sky. Tom seemed to be thinking along similar lines, because as they watched the firefighters work, he began asking questions about local animal shelters and whether she'd seen any signs of other dogs in the area recently. His tone suggested he was already formulating plans, the kind of practical problem-solving approach that rural communities developed out of necessity, where neighbors looked after each other and stray animals became everyone's responsibility until a permanent solution could be found. The fire burned for another 2 hours, though the immediate danger passed much sooner, as the volunteers managed to contain the flames to the barn structure itself and create sufficient fire breaks to prevent spreading. By the time Chief Rodriguez declared the scene secure, Sarah's barn was nothing more than a blackened skeleton of support beams and twisted metal roofing, still smoking but no longer actively burning, while the puppy had fallen asleep in her arms with the exhausted trust of a creature that had survived trauma and found safety. The aftermath brought a stream of neighbors she'd only met briefly before, people who'd seen the smoke column from miles away and came to offer help, water for the firefighters, and the kind of practical support that rural communities provided automatically in times of crisis. Martha's sister brought sandwiches and coffee. The teenage son of a family down the road offered to help with cleanup, and several people mentioned knowing someone who might be interested in adopting a puppy if she couldn't keep it herself. But as the day wore on and she found herself reluctant to put the small golden form down for more than a few minutes at a time, Sarah began to realize that the question of the puppy's future might already be settled. Something had changed during those terrifying minutes in the smoke-filled barn. A bond had formed that felt stronger than the circumstances that created it, and every time she looked into those trusting brown eyes, she felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from her rural experiment. Tom helped her examine the barn's remains once they'd cooled sufficiently, pointing out which tools and equipment might be salvageable and discussing the practical steps she'd need to take with insurance companies and rebuilding contractors. His knowledge was invaluable, but she found herself more focused on the way the puppy stayed close to her feet during the inspection, as if understanding somehow that their fates had become intertwined in ways that transcended the morning's drama. The local veterinarian, Dr. Sarah Chen, arrived in the early afternoon after Tom called her to check on the puppy's condition. Bringing a portable examination kit and the kind of calm competence that came from years of treating animals in challenging circumstances. Her assessment was reassuring. The rope burns were superficial and would heal quickly with proper care. There were no signs of serious smoke inhalation, and aside from being somewhat underweight, the puppy appeared healthy and well socialized, suggesting it had been cared for by humans recently. Dr. Chen estimated the puppy's age at about 12 weeks and noted that it was a purebred golden retriever, probably worth several $100s if someone was looking to sell it, which raised questions about how it had ended up alone and tangled in an abandoned barn. She offered to check with other veterinarians in the region and post information on social media to see if anyone was missing a puppy, but also mentioned that if no owner came forward within a reasonable time, Sarah had obviously proven herself capable of providing good care. That evening, as she sat on her front porch with the puppy curled up beside her on an old blanket, Sarah found herself calling her parents in Seattle to tell them about the day's events. Their concern was immediate and vocal, her mother expressing worry about the dangers of rural living, while her father asked practical questions about insurance coverage and rebuilding costs. But underneath their urban anxiety, she could hear something that might have been pride in her handling of the crisis. The puppy stirred as she talked, lifting its head to look at her with an expression that seemed to combine gratitude, trust, and the beginning of affection, and she realized that regardless of whether anyone came forward to claim it, this small creature had already changed something fundamental about her experience of this place. The barn could be rebuilt, the equipment replaced, but the sense of purpose and connection she felt watching over this vulnerable life was something entirely new. Over the following days, as word spread through the community about the barn fire and the puppy rescue, Sarah found herself experiencing a level of acceptance and belonging that months of polite neighborly interaction hadn't achieved. People stopped by with donations of puppy food and toys, shared stories of their own animal rescues, and began including her in conversations about community events and local issues, with the assumption that she was now a permanent part of their rural family. Tom Fletcher became a regular presence, helping with the barn cleanup and sharing his knowledge about dog training and care with the enthusiasm of someone who'd missed having animals around since his wife's death. His stories about the various dogs they'd owned over the years provided Sarah with practical guidance about puppy behavior and health, but more importantly, they created a bridge between her urban background and the rural wisdom she was still learning to navigate. The puppy, which she'd begun calling Scout after its tendency to explore every corner of her property with fearless curiosity, adapted to its new life with the resilience that seemed characteristic of golden retrievers. Within a week, it was following her around the property like a small golden shadow, learning to come when called, and showing the beginnings of the loyalty and intelligence that made the breed so beloved as farm dogs. No one ever came forward to claim Scout, despite Dr. Chen's efforts to locate a possible owner, and after 3 weeks, Sarah stopped expecting anyone to appear with proof of ownership and demands for return. The puppy had become so integrated into her daily routine that she couldn't imagine her rural life without the companionship and purpose that caring for another living creature provided. The insurance settlement for the barn came through faster than expected, partly because Chief Rodriguez's report clearly documented the electrical failure that had caused the fire, and partly because her grandmother had maintained excellent coverage on all the farm structures. The amount was sufficient not only to rebuild but to upgrade, installing modern electrical systems and fire suppression equipment that would prevent similar disasters in the future. As autumn progressed toward winter, Sarah found herself looking forward to the challenges ahead with an optimism that had been missing from her initial move to Montana. The barn reconstruction project gave her something concrete to focus on. Scout provided daily companionship and motivation to maintain regular outdoor routines, and the community connections forged through the crisis had evolved into genuine friendships that made her rural isolation feel more like rural independence. The story of the barn fire and puppy rescue had taken on a life of its own in local telling, growing slightly with each retelling until she'd become something of a minor celebrity in the county, known as the city girl who'd risked her life to save a stray puppy and proved herself worthy of rural respect. While the attention sometimes embarrassed her, she couldn't deny that it had opened doors and created opportunities for belonging that might have taken years to develop through normal social processes. Tom Fletcher's friendship had deepened into something approaching a father-daughter relationship. his loneliness finding purpose in teaching her the skills and knowledge that rural life demanded, while her presence provided him with someone to worry about and guide through the complexities of country living. Their evening conversations over coffee had become a routine that enriched both their lives, creating the kind of intergenerational connection that modern life often failed to provide. When the first serious snow of the season arrived in early December, Sarah stood at her kitchen window, watching Scout experience snow for the first time, his puppy excitement and confusion creating a moment of pure joy that seemed to crystallize everything good about the choices she'd made. The new barn was nearly complete, rising from the ashes of the old one with modern efficiency but traditional lines that honored the property's history while embracing its future. The morning dew that had started this chapter of her life seemed like a memory from another season now, replaced by frost that turned her breath visible and reminded her daily of the harsh realities that winter would bring. But she faced those challenges with confidence born from surviving crisis and finding her place in a community that had tested her and found her worthy of membership. Scout had grown from a terrified puppy into a confident young dog, his golden coat thick and healthy, his loyalty absolute, his presence a constant reminder that sometimes the most important relationships begin in moments of crisis when normal social barriers fall away and deeper connections become possible. The neighbors still called her a hero when the story came up in conversation, but she knew the real heroism had been in staying, in choosing to build a life that honored both the independence she'd sought and the interdependence that rural communities required for survival. Standing there watching her dog play in the snow while smoke rose from her chimney and the rebuilt barn stood solid against the Montana sky, Sarah Martinez understood that she'd found something more valuable than the safety she'd left behind in the city. She'd discovered the person she was capable of becoming when circumstances demanded courage and community provided support for the journey toward that better version of herself.